back for a video on a summary of nephron function. So in this video I'll run through the nephron segment by segment, sort of giving a broad overview of what each region is specialized to do essentially. All right, so again, I'm going to draw this. It will be anatomically incorrect for a reason I'll point out here in a second. Start. The glomerulus, remember the efferent arteriole leads to the peritubular capillaries, to and from which reabsorption and secretion occur. Right? Draw my nephron. Got Bowman's capsule, PCT, loop Henle, DCT. This is where it becomes anatomically inaccurate. Well, it's very anatomically inaccurate, but more so. Okay, so what I've drawn here is a juxtamedullary nephron. Remember, there are two versions of nephrons. There are the nephrons that are short-looped and stay almost entirely up in the cortex. Of course, their collecting duct has to run down. Collecting ducts are shared anyway. They don't belong to a single nephron. The collecting ducts, this could be coming from a cortical nephron up above and then run down into the medulla. What I've drawn here is a juxtamedullary nephron because they essentially have one additional function that cortical nephrons don't possess. And so by covering this type, which is actually the minority, it's only 10 to 15% of total number of the nephrons, but it's the group that has one extra function. So if we understand this type of nephron, we also understand the cortical nephron, which just lacks that one specific function that's going to be based upon this really long loop of Henle, so they're called long-looped nephrons. And we'll come back to why that long loop of Henle that goes down into the medulla is so important. So again, just to be clear, right, our corticomedullary border would be somewhere about here, with the glomerulus, renal corpuscle, PCT and DCT sitting up in the cortex, and then a loop and a collecting duct running down through down into the medulla, the pyramids of the medulla, ending at the papilla, which is basically the tip of the pyramid, where, even do it in yellow, where urine exits the nephron to enter the open spaces, the calyces and the pelvis, which lead to the ureter, which leads to the bladder, right? So this is how urine exits the nephron to enter those passages that get it to the bladder. Okay, so we filter at a rate that wildly exceeds, I mean total plasma filtration rate, that wildly exceeds what we would actually want to excrete, at least for water, electrolytes, and nutrients. Now wastes, right, we want to pretty much excrete most or even all of what becomes filtered. So the PCT, we've just filtered this enormous volume, and so now we want to start reabsorbing the things that we don't actually want to end up excreting. And so what we're going to do is, I have a previous video that shows you all the mechanisms of transport that the PCT utilizes to move ions, nutrients, and water into the interstitium, where they'll then be taken up by reabsorption. Remember, a negative net filtration pressure at the peritubular capillaries. Right? Remember, this is the PCT, proximal convoluted tubule. And we get about 65 to 70%, about 2/3 of the ions and water reabsorbed. There's a few ions that are a little higher, a little lower than that, but about 2/3 of the electrolytes and water. We get 100% of the nutrients being reabsorbed. Okay, basically, no nutrients make it into the loop of Henle or DCT. They've already been completely reabsorbed. The exception to that is in an untreated diabetic, when certain blood nutrients, specifically glucose, but could be others as well, rise to levels that exceed the transport maximum. Remember, the transport maximum is the maximum rate of transport of a solute becomes exceeded by the amount of solute that's being delivered to the nephron. So if the transport maximum is 250 milligrams per deciliter for glucose, and blood glucose goes to 300, right, a very atypical 3 times normal levels, then some of that will, get past the transporters. And then remember, there's no glucose transporters in any of the distal nephron here, and so that glucose would end up getting excreted. Right? Again, that's not the normal. Normally, our clearance of glucose and amino acids and fatty acids and any other nutrient we want to think of, the clearance should be 0. Right? If we do start excreting them, then of course the clearance is no longer 0, but again, that's a pathological condition. All right, so our PCT is doing the majority of our reabsorption. It does do a little bit of secretion. Well, I should say little. It does a fair amount of secretion. Right? It secretes protons, but it can also secrete drugs, it can secrete toxins, it can secrete other waste molecules, and again, they would be added to the tubular fluid from the interstitium, and then to sort of resupply the interstitium, essentially, they're going to diffuse from the higher PTC concentration into the lower interstitial concentration where we've just removed them and put them in the nephron. Again, this is for the wastes and toxins and things like that, pesticides that you may come in with your diet that need to be eliminated from the body. Okay, so one last thing is that we filtered this sort of protein-free plasma, right? And we filtered it at a concentration, sorry, it's a little bit small, right? But a concentration of about 300 milliosms per liter. That's normal plasma osmolarity, approximately. At the end of the nephron, the concentration is about 300 milliosms per liter. But it's not the same 300 milliosms because your nutrient levels fell to 0, but your waste levels rose fairly dramatically. So what it means is that we isosmotically reabsorbed, right? Saw the amount of water that went with the amount of solute, went sort of like 1-to-1, keeping the concentration the same. But again, that doesn't mean that this looks like plasma anymore. It looks dramatically different than plasma now. And we're going to continue to keep tweaking it. So at this point, we enter the loop of Henle. Okay, this is the loop. The beach. And we kind of have to jump over to the ascending, right? This is the descending limb. This is the ascending limb, right? In terms of our flow. We kind of have to jump over to the ascending limb to understand what's going to happen to the descending limb, right? And so in the ascending limb, we have specific transporters within the tubule wall that are going to move collectively sodium and chloride out into the interstitial space. Now, it's a fairly complex combination of transporters that allow this to occur. But the primary one, the one that's in addition to sort of the normal, is called the NKCC2 cotransporter. So it moves N, right, sodium, K, potassium, C, chloride, right, and actually moves 2 chlorides to remain electroneutral, 2 cations, 2 anions. And it moves those from the tubular fluid into the nephron cells. And then there's a chloride channel and the sodium-potassium pump, right? The chloride channel allows the chloride to be reabsorbed into the interstitial space. The sodium-potassium pump drives sodium into the same space, and we've just reabsorbed chloride and sodium, right, across those cells. Now, that means, and what's going to happen is we make the interstitium saltier, essentially. And that's going to happen like in a non-linear fashion. In other words, we're going to transport more salt at the base of towards the loop of the nephron, of the loop, than up here at the very end of it. And so we end up with a gradient of solutes in the interstitium. And that gradient goes from about 300 up here in the cortex, interstitial solute gradient, right? 300 milliosmoles per liter, and then it's going to end up at about 1200 down here. Now, again, maximally, this can change, but sort of under optimal concentrating conditions, it'll go from about 300 to about 1200 milliosmoles per liter. Right? Now, because of that gradient, the descending limb is going to respond to the environment it's entering. And the only characteristic of the descending limb that's really important is the fact that it is water permeable, and only water permeable, which means that as this comes down, this 300 in the tubular fluid concentration is going to encounter, put a number out here, 400 on the outside. Well, saltier on the outside, less salty on the inside, we're going to draw water out. So water is going to move toward, right, and it's 600 out here, we draw more water out, 800, 1,000, 1,200, right, we keep moving water out, right, reabsorbing more water. We only reabsorb 2/3 of it up here, so reabsorbing another, 20% or so here is perfectly fine and needs to be done. But what it means is that we're going to have a very concentrated tubular fluid down here at the U-turn, essentially, of the loop. And I'm going to call it 1100. Again, if the interstitium is 1200. The only reason I don't call it 1200 is because it's flowing. It doesn't reach perfect equilibrium, right? And so it's going to be something less than this sort of maximal interstitial osmolarity. But then it starts going back up. And in the ascending limb, we are largely water impermeable, but we're now transporting solute out. So we just reduced the volume on this side. Now we're going to reduce the salt content on this side, but the volume is going to stay the same. So, right, we're going to continue to move sodium and chloride out. And so the osmolarity of the tubular fluid falls and falls and falls. And actually falls to a hypotonic state where entering the DCT, it's somewhere in the ballpark of 200 or 250. Right? We'll call it 200. Maybe even a hair lower in some cases. But regardless, right, we've become hypotonic, at least a little bit hypotonic because of the salt removal. Now, on the ascending limb. So the net effect here is the loop of Henle has reabsorbed water and sodium and chloride. It actually reabsorbs some other electrolytes, especially once we get up to the top here of the ascending limb, because of charge repulsion that we had talked about in the PCT. And so we end up reabsorbing some calcium and potassium and other ions. But the dominant effect is the sodium and chloride and water reabsorption. Okay, well that's good and that's important. But in addition, we created the corticomedullary solute gradient, right? And that's going to be important when we get over here and start talking about the collecting duct and our ability to conserve water and adjust the final content, I shouldn't say content, concentration and volume of our urine. In other words, are you drinking a lot of water and you need to excrete a large volume dilute urine, or are you somewhat dehydrated and you need to conserve water and allow a very small volume to be excreted into urine, right? And this concentration gradient is going to provide the driving force for that water reabsorption over here. Okay, so the loop of Henle is often referred to as a countercurrent multiplier. We're taking this solute transport differential between, right, the concentration between inside and outside difference. It's called the single effect, and we're sort of like amplifying it, right? Not the single effect itself, but amplifying it overall, because as we move solute out and make this saltier, we pull more water out over here, which concentrates the tubular fluid more, which supplies the transporters, which, right, then can transport more, which allows more water to be pulled out, right? And so it's sort of like, it's a little bit of positive feedback. Now it's limited by the overall effectiveness, right? It sort of maximizes at some point. And we have to remember that we have blood flow down here that's going to be washing out a bit of this gradient, which is why it has to be continuously restored through this mechanism. But the loop of Henle as a whole creates the corticomedullary solute gradient for the purposes over at the collecting duct of retaining water. Now I do like to throw in the vasorecta at this point in the discussion of the nephron, because the vasorecta are the peritubular capillaries of the medulla, so they're the capillaries that supply these regions of the nephron. And they come down and they also form a loop. Right? And then so we've got our descending and ascending vasa recta. Right? This is the vasa recta. Right? And so, remember, capillaries are very permeable to all of to water and all small solutes, right? And so on the way down, right, they're entering a saltier and saltier environment here, and so solute will move in, but water will move out, right? So we've got this scenario, right? As it gets saltier on the outside, sodium and chloride will move in, but water is moving down its gradient in the opposite direction and be moving out. All right, which will create a scenario that kind of looks like this one, right? Where we added solute, removed water, which makes the plasma concentration here very high. And again, it was coming in at about 300 because that's our normal blood osmolarity, right? And so again, we could put 1100 on it, right? But on the way back up, now it's leaving that concentration gradient, right? And so solute's going to move back out, right? And it gets less and less concentrated on the outside, which means water is going to move in, right? Well, check it out. On the way down, we gained solute, right? On the way back up, we lose it. On the way down, we lose water. On the way back up, we regain it. And the intended point here is that we just did nothing, right? And we delivered oxygen and nutrients, very important functions, but we did nothing to this gradient. In other words, we sort of picked it up and then put it back. Pick it up, put it back. It's just sort of like stirring it without removing it. If you think about it, what I always try to do is say, well, if we didn't have an ascending vasa recta and the blood just sort of left the bottom of the pyramid down here, well, it would have, right? We would have lost a bunch of water, would have gained a bunch of solute, and left the kidney, right? In which case it would just be actively washing out the gradient continuously. By flipping it around and having it form a loop, you get to undo what happened on the descending limb in the ascending limb. Now, having said that, we did reabsorb water and solute, and we're going to reabsorb more water over here. Remember, these capillaries are not, they're not separated. These capillaries are kind of sitting on top of all these structures. And so the vasa recta do reabsorb the extra water and solutes that these nephron segments are reabsorbing. And so the ascending flow actually exceeds the descending. In fact, there are actually more ascending vasa recta than there are descending vasa recta to accommodate that increased flow because of all the reabsorption occurring in these nephron segments. Okay, now I think we're ready for the DCT, right? When we enter the DCT, it's all about regulation, right? We've basically gotten ourselves down to probably the last 15% or so of the filtered volume. But remember, 15% of 180 liters a day is still a lot of fluid, right? We do not want to be excreting 20 plus liters of urine per day. So we still have to reabsorb a significant amount of water. There's still some solutes to be reabsorbed. No nutrients. All the nutrients have been removed. But the DCT is about sort of like fine-tuning the electrolyte levels, right? And acid-base regulation. And that's going to be hormonally controlled. We don't really need, because filtration is so big, we don't really need to control the early rates of reabsorption. We just need to reabsorb a lot very quickly, right? If you filter all of your plasma sodium every 20 minutes, do we really need to regulate the first 85% that we reabsorb? No, right? We're going to adjust the final 1% or so that was filtered, and that'll allow us to excrete, more or less of the salt that we take in a day, right? If you eat a high salt diet, let a little bit more go. If you eat a low salt diet, you're going to retain more. And that regulation that takes place, it's a DCT and cortical collecting duct. And so we get, more ions. We get more secretion, again, usually of protons, other ways as well. If you are metabolically alkaline, right, basic, we do have the ability to secrete bicarbonate, which does just the opposite. We tend to make pH go down instead of up, right? Here we're secreting what I've shown you as a normal metabolic acid producer, which is what most people typically are. And by doing so, if you secrete acid, it tends to bring your body pH up, right? That's usually the direction we need to go. Okay, and I'll have another video, I think, about the specific actions of the hormones, but the hormones involved in regulating reabsorption here are testosterone, ADH. We can throw in ANF, sometimes referred to as ANP, atrial natriuretic factor. We can throw in parathyroid hormone and calcitriol. Right? These two are going to be involved in calcium. The ADH is involved only in water reabsorption. Aldosterone and ANF are regulating sodium reabsorption. And again, we'll give you the directionality of their control in another video. And then specific to aldosterone, we've got potassium regulation. Okay. We could throw angiotensin II in there. It does have some effects on sodium directly, but most of its actions on reabsorption are mediated by the two hormones it stimulates, aldosterone and ADH. Okay, last segment, right? Again, so we'll come back to the mechanisms of control there, but we're just adjusting the amounts of the individual ions and water that are being reabsorbed here. We enter the collecting duct, and it becomes all about, largely about, acid-base regulation, so more of the same here. Are you secreting protons or are you secreting bicarbonate to adjust body fluid pH, extracellular fluid pH? And then we need to adjust the volume, right? Because again, we've got, more than a dozen liters probably that make it to the beginning of the collecting duct, probably on the order of 15 or more liters per day collectively, all nephrons. Again, that would be an enormous volume of urine for a day, so we need to reabsorb water. Now, how that's done is we generated the gradient, right, in the interstitium over here at the loop of Henle. And remember, that gradient is everywhere, right, on the outside of the nephron segments. But it is going to allow us, so if we come into the collecting duct at about 300, which is probably about right, and then we enter this more hypertonic interstitium, then water is going to start to leave. Now the interesting piece here is that water leaving the nephron is regulated now, right? The antidiuretic hormone stimulates an aquaporin 2, in the apical membranes of both the DCT and the collecting ducts, which I should add water here, water absorption, right? Regulated by ADH. But the ADH stimulates aquaporin 2s, which allow us to have a complete transcellular pathway for water. The basolateral membrane already has an aquaporin. It's constitutively expressed, so it means it's always there. The one in the apical membrane is added in the presence of ADH. And again, if you don't have a urine volume per day of 15 or more liters, then you have ADH secretion, right? And you have aquaporin 2s that's allowing us to reabsorb a significant volume of water, right, across this collecting duct. So at the collecting duct, you essentially need two things, right? I refer to the DCT as well. You need water permeability, and you need a transepithelial solute gradient. You need it to be saltier on the outside than it is on the inside to pull that water out osmotically, right? And so the stimulus for ADH, again, another separate video, is the primary stimulus is plasma osmolarity, a higher plasma osmolarity. And so that would indicate that you're dehydrated, right? If the osmolarity goes up, you become more concentrated, dehydrated. To solve that problem, right? We need to retain more water, which means we need greater water permeability, which means we need more aquaporin 2s, which means we need more ADH. Right? The ADH puts the more aquaporin 2s in, we more effectively pull water into the interstitium. Sorry, emergency system going off. We effectively reduce the volume of our urine. The last thing the collecting duct does is actively drive urea reabsorption, which is a bit of an oxymoron, right? Your nephron is reabsorbing a waste product. That doesn't seem to make sense. But it still does excrete a fair amount of it, effectively excretes it, but we're saving some of it to add to this interstitial solute gradient. Again, so as urea leaves, what's going to tend to go with it? Water. And now that the urea content out here in the interstitium being added to, right, so let's circle this guy, right, being added to our sodium and chloride that's already out here enhances, so this 1200, or anywhere you want to look here, is actually the sum of sodium and chloride and urea. And urea accounts for probably about 25 or 30% of that, so it's not insignificant. It is helping us have a bigger gradient and then therefore more effectively reabsorb water at the collecting duct.